The heavens were about to tear open, and one man would never be the same. Picture this: a kingdom drowning in corruption, where the rich devoured the poor, and priests performed empty rituals while injustice ruled the streets. Then suddenly, a blinding vision, a throne suspended between heaven and earth. Creatures with 6 wings covering their faces, crying out in terror and worship before a presence so holy that even angels couldn't bear to look directly at him. The temple shook. Reality itself trembled, and there stood Isaiah, a man with unclean lips, face to face with the God who sees everything. "Whom shall I send?" The question thundered through eternity. What happened next would change the destiny of nations. Isaiah would see things that hadn't occurred yet. A virgin bearing a child called God with us. A suffering servant pierced for sins he didn't commit. A king whose government would never end. But he would also see destruction, betrayal, and a people who would hear truth but choose blindness. Kings would tremble at his words. Empires would rise and fall exactly as he predicted. And centuries later, a carpenter from Nazareth would stand in a synagogue and declare, "Today, Isaiah's words are fulfilled." What did Isaiah see that made him volunteer for an impossible mission? What prophecies did he unlock that still shake our world today? The vision is about to unfold, and nothing will prepare you for what comes next. The year King Uzziah died was a year nobody in Judah would forget. For over 5 decades, this king had sat on the throne, guiding the nation through wars and peace, through growth and challenge. His reign had been long, 52 years to be exact, and for most people living in Judah, Uzziah was the only king they had ever known. When he died, the whole nation felt the loss. There was uncertainty in the air. Who would lead them now? What would happen to their prosperity? Isaiah was among those who felt the weight of this moment. He was a young man, probably in his 20s or early 30s, and he had grown up during Uzziah's reign. Like many others, he went to the temple to pray, to seek God, perhaps to find some sense of direction in this time of transition. The temple in Jerusalem was the heart of the nation's worship, the place where God's presence was said to dwell among his people. But what happened to Isaiah that day was anything but natural. As he stood in the temple, something beyond his wildest imagination began to unfold. Isaiah chapter 6 verse 1 tells us, "In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple." Isaiah saw the Lord, not in a dream, not in his imagination, but in a vision so real and so powerful that it would mark him for the rest of his life. The Lord was sitting on a throne, and this throne wasn't on ground level. It was high, elevated above everything else. The train of God's robe filled the temple. Think about that image. A robe so vast that just the trailing edge of it filled the entire temple building. Above the throne, Isaiah saw creatures he had never encountered before. These were seraphim, and the Bible tells us that each one had 6 wings. The very name seraphim means burning ones, suggesting beings of fire and intense holiness. Each seraph used its wings in a specific way. 2 wings covered their faces, as if even these holy beings couldn't look directly at God. 2 wings covered their feet, showing humility and reverence. And with the remaining 2 wings, they flew. These seraphim weren't standing still. They called out to one another, their voices creating a chorus that filled the heavenly space. Isaiah watched all of this unfold before his eyes. The throne, the robe, the seraphim. Every detail burned itself into his memory. This wasn't a casual prayer time. This was an encounter with the living God, the ruler of the universe, the king above all kings. The seraphim that Isaiah saw weren't just floating silently around God's throne. They had a message, and they proclaimed it with voices that shook everything around them. Isaiah chapter 6 verse 3 records what they said. "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory." Notice that they said holy 3 times. In Hebrew culture, Repetition was a way of emphasizing something important. When you repeated it 3 times, you were saying it was the most important thing possible. The seraphim were declaring that holiness is the core of who God is. But what does holy actually mean? It means to be set apart, completely different, pure in every way. God is holy because he is unlike anything or anyone else in creation. There is no darkness in him, no flaw, no imperfection. He is holiness itself. The seraphim also declared, "The whole earth is full of his glory." God's glory is his visible presence, his weight of importance, the manifestation of his character. And according to these heavenly beings, this glory filled the entire earth. The moment these words were spoken, something extraordinary happened. Verse 4 tells us, "And the posts of the door were shaken by the voice of him who cried out, and the house was filled with smoke." The physical structure of the temple responded to the worship. The doorposts began to shake. This was a powerful shaking caused by the voice of worship. Then smoke filled the temple. This wasn't ordinary smoke. This was the visible presence of God's glory, a thick cloud that represented his holiness and majesty. The smoke filled every corner, making it difficult to see clearly. The air became heavy, thick with divine presence. Isaiah stood in the middle of it all, a human being who had stumbled into something far beyond human experience. The worship of the seraphim continued. "Holy, holy, holy," echoed through the space. The doorposts kept shaking. The smoke kept swirling. This wasn't a gentle, comforting experience. This was overwhelming, almost terrifying. The holiness of God isn't something that makes you feel cozy. It's something that makes you aware of how small you are, how limited your understanding is, how vast the gap is between the Creator and his creation. Standing in that smoke-filled temple, surrounded by the worship of seraphim, hearing the echoes of "Holy, holy, holy" reverberating through the space, Isaiah suddenly became aware of something that terrified him. In the blazing light of God's holiness, he saw himself clearly for the first time, and what he saw made him cry out in horror. The words burst from his mouth, recorded in verse 5, "Woe is me, for I am undone, because I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts." The word woe was serious. It was the kind of word people used when announcing disaster or death. Isaiah was pronouncing this word on himself. "Woe is me." He said, "I am undone," which means "I am destroyed" or "I am ruined." Isaiah felt like he was disintegrating. Why such an extreme reaction? Because he had just encountered perfect holiness, and in that encounter he realized how far short he fell. He specifically mentioned his lips being unclean. This is important because the mouth and lips are the instruments we use to communicate. Isaiah was recognizing that his words had not been pure. Maybe he had gossiped, maybe he had spoken carelessly, maybe he had said things that were dishonest or hurtful. Whatever the specific failures were, Isaiah knew that his speech had been contaminated with sin. But he didn't stop with just himself. He said, "I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips." The entire nation of Judah suffered from the same condition. The people spoke lies, engaged in gossip, and used their words to tear others down. Then came the most alarming part. "My eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts." In the ancient understanding, there was a belief that no sinful person could see God and survive. His holiness was too intense for contaminated human beings to withstand, and now Isaiah had seen him. The contrast was devastating. On one side, there was God, holy, 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 perfect in every way. On the other side, there was Isaiah, sinful, broken, unclean. How could someone as contaminated as Isaiah exist in the presence of someone as pure as God? Isaiah wasn't making excuses. He was seeing himself in the light of God's holiness, and that light exposed everything. There was nowhere to hide, no way to pretend. Isaiah had confessed his unworthiness. He stood convinced that his end had come. But then something unexpected happened. One of the seraphim moved toward Isaiah with purpose, and in the seraph's hand was something that should have terrified Isaiah: a live coal, a burning ember taken directly from the altar. The seraph had used tongs to pick up this coal because it was too hot to touch. This was active fire, glowing with intense heat, and it was coming straight toward Isaiah's face. Verse 6 and 7 describe what happened. Then one of the seraphim flew to me, having in his hand a live coal, which he had taken with the tongs from the altar. And he touched my mouth with it and said, "Behold, this has touched your lips. Your iniquity is taken away, and your sin purged." The coal touched Isaiah's lips. The very part of his body that he had confessed was unclean was now being touched by burning coal from God's altar. But something miraculous was happening. The coal that should have burned Isaiah instead did something entirely different. The seraph spoke, "Behold, this has touched your lips. Your iniquity is taken away, and your sin purged." Isaiah's guilt was removed, gone. The word purged means cleansed completely, like scrubbing something until no trace of dirt remains. The altar in the temple was the place where sacrifices were made, where the blood of animals was offered to cover sins. And now a coal from that very altar was touching Isaiah, showing that his sin was being dealt with according to God's provision. This was pure grace. Isaiah hadn't cleaned himself up. He hadn't performed a ritual to make himself worthy. He had simply stood there, broken and aware of his sin. And God had provided the cleansing. The seraph didn't say, "Try harder next time." The message was immediate and complete. Your iniquity is taken away, and your sin purged. Past tense, done, finished. Fire in the Bible often represents purification. When metal workers want to purify gold, they heat it to extreme temperatures. The impurities rise to the surface and can be removed, leaving pure metal behind. And now Isaiah was experiencing spiritual purification. After this moment, Isaiah was fundamentally changed. The guilt that had crushed him was gone. The sin that had separated him from God was removed. He had been transformed from someone who was undone into someone who was clean and acceptable before a holy God. With his sin cleansed and his guilt removed, Isaiah stood in a completely different position. The smoke still filled the temple. The seraphim still worshipped. God's presence still surrounded everything, but Isaiah was no longer undone. He was purified, cleansed, and ready. And that's when God spoke. Verse 8 records what happened. "Also I heard the voice of the Lord saying, 'Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?'" This wasn't a command. This was an invitation, a question, an opportunity for someone to volunteer. God was looking for a messenger. Notice that God said us. Who will go for us? This plural reference hints at the complex nature of God's being. What's remarkable is the timing. God didn't ask this question before Isaiah's cleansing. He didn't call an unclean man to serve him. The call came after the purification. First came grace, then came the call to service. And Isaiah's response? Immediate. He said, "Here am I. Send me." 6 simple words, but they carried enormous weight. Isaiah was volunteering for something he didn't yet fully understand. He didn't know the details. He didn't know how long it would last. But he said yes anyway. "Here am I" means I'm present. I'm available. I'm ready. And "send me" means I'm willing to go wherever you want. Willing to do whatever you want. It was complete surrender, total availability, absolute willingness. This is the natural response of someone who has truly encountered God's grace. When you understand what God has done for you, when you recognize that He has taken away your sin and made you clean, serving Him becomes a joy, not a burden. Think about the transformation. Isaiah had entered the temple as a regular man. He had seen God and cried out, "Woe is me!" He had been cleansed by the coal from the altar, and now he was volunteering for divine service. That's the power of God's grace. God had asked a question, and Isaiah had given an answer. This was a prophetic commission, a divine calling, an appointment that would shape everything Isaiah would do for the rest of his life. He was now a prophet, a spokesman for God, a messenger who would carry divine words to the nation. Isaiah had volunteered with enthusiasm, but God wasn't going to hide the nature of the assignment. What came next was sobering. Verses 9 and 10 contain some of the most difficult words any prophet ever received. And he said, "Go and tell this people, keep on hearing, but do not understand. Keep on seeing, but do not perceive. Make the heart of this people dull, and their ears heavy, and shut their eyes, lest they see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their heart, and return, and be healed." God was telling Isaiah that the people would hear his messages, but wouldn't understand them. They would see the signs, but wouldn't perceive their meaning. This wasn't going to be a ministry of mass conversions. This was going to be speaking truth to people who would reject it. The problem wasn't that Isaiah would be a poor communicator. The issue was with the people's hearts. They had become hardened, resistant, unwilling to respond to God's truth. God described their condition vividly. Their hearts would be dull, calloused, insensitive, unresponsive. Their ears would be heavy, spiritually unwilling to hear. Their eyes would be shut, deliberately closed to truth. This was about spiritual stubbornness. The people had the capacity to understand, but they didn't want to. They could hear, but they chose not to. This had to be discouraging news. God was essentially telling Isaiah, "You're going to preach, and people won't listen. You're going to warn them, and they won't change." But this reveals something crucial. Success isn't measured by how many people respond positively. Success is measured by faithfulness to what God has called you to do. Isaiah's job was to speak what God told him to speak, regardless of how people responded. This also demonstrates God's justice. He wouldn't judge the people without first warning them. Even though he knew they would reject the message, he still sent a prophet. Every person would have the opportunity to hear and repent. Isaiah now understood the assignment. It wouldn't be glamorous. It wouldn't make him popular. But it was what God had called him to do. After hearing about the rejection he would face, Isaiah asked a natural question. How long would this situation last? When would things change? Verse 11 records it. "Then I said, Lord, how long?" God's answer wasn't comforting. "Until the cities are laid waste and without inhabitant, the houses are without a man, the land is utterly desolate. The Lord has removed men far away, and the forsaken places are many in the midst of the land." The hardness wouldn't end with revival. It would end with destruction. The cities would be destroyed, left empty. The houses would stand vacant. The land would become desolate. God would remove the people far away into exile. This was the reality of persistent rebellion. When people continually reject God's warnings, judgment eventually comes, but verse 13 contains hope. "But yet a tenth will be in it, and will return and be for consuming, as a terebinth tree or as an oak, whose stump remains when it is cut down. So the holy seed shall be its stump, a small remnant would survive." Like a tree stump that contains potential for new growth, this remnant would preserve God's purposes. They would be the holy seed. Isaiah's question about duration received a sobering answer. This would span his entire lifetime and beyond. Isaiah would spend decades speaking to people who largely wouldn't listen. And yet, he would have to remain faithful, trusting that God knew what he was doing. To understand why Isaiah's mission would be so difficult, we need to look at Judah's spiritual condition. On the surface, everything looked good. King Uzziah's reign had brought prosperity and military strength. But beneath this prosperous surface, something was deeply wrong. The people had maintained their religious practices, but their hearts had drifted far from God. Their worship had become empty ritual. They thought they could please God with external ceremonies while living however they wanted. Isaiah chapter 1, verses 11 through 15 shows how God viewed their religion. "To what purpose is the multitude of your sacrifices to me? I have had enough of burnt offerings. Bring no more futile sacrifices. Incense is an abomination to me. God was rejecting their worship because they were using religion as a cover for wickedness. They would offer sacrifices and then oppress the poor. They would observe the Sabbath and then cheat in business. The wealthy had become particularly corrupt. They used their power to take advantage of those who couldn't defend themselves. Widows and orphans were exploited. Courts were filled with bribery. The poor had no hope of fair treatment. Isaiah 5 describes how the rich were buying up land, creating monopolies, concentrating wealth. Meanwhile, people pursued pleasure without restraint, partying while ignoring God. Idolatry had also crept in. Though they claimed to worship the God of Israel, they mixed in pagan practices. They consulted mediums and spiritists. Their faith had become syncretistic. The leaders were particularly guilty. Instead of guiding people toward righteousness, they led them deeper into sin. False prophets promised peace when there was no peace. This was the Judah that Isaiah was called to address. These were the people who would hear his warnings and ignore them. Isaiah would spend his entire ministry trying to wake up a nation determined to sleep through its own destruction. Isaiah's ministry didn't begin with gentle encouragement or comfortable messages. From the very start, God directed him to confront the ugly reality of what Judah had become. The nation might have looked prosperous on the outside, but inside it was rotting with injustice and corruption. The wealthy elite had become greedy beyond measure. Isaiah chapter 5 verse 8 describes their actions. Woe to those who join house to house. They add field to field, till there is no place where they may dwell alone in the midst of the land. These rich landowners weren't satisfied with what they had. They kept buying more property, adding one house to another, connecting one field to the next, expanding their estates until there was nothing left for anyone else. This wasn't just smart business. This was oppression. Small farmers who had worked their land for generations were being pushed out. Families who had inherited modest plots from their ancestors were losing everything. The wealthy were creating monopolies, concentrating all the resources in fewer and fewer hands, leaving ordinary people with nowhere to live and no way to support themselves. The land that God had given to Israel was supposed to be distributed fairly among the tribes and families. But now the powerful were swallowing up everything, treating land like a commodity to hoard rather than a gift from God to be shared. They built their mansions and expanded their farms while pushing the poor into desperate poverty. The entire justice system had collapsed. Isaiah chapter 1 verse 23 exposes the problem. Your princes are rebellious and companions of thieves. Everyone loves bribes and follows after rewards. They do not defend the fatherless, nor does the cause of the widow come before them. The very people who were supposed to protect the vulnerable had become their predators. Judges who should have been impartial were accepting bribes. If you had money, you could buy a favorable verdict. If you were poor, you had no chance of justice. The courts that were meant to be places of fairness had become marketplaces where justice was sold to the highest bidder. Widows and orphans were the most vulnerable members of society. In ancient Israel, a woman without a husband and children without a father had no one to provide for them or protect them. God's law specifically commanded his people to care for these helpless ones. But instead of protecting them, the leaders were taking advantage of them, denying them justice, stealing from them. Isaiah chapter 10, verses 1 and 2 captures God's anger. Woe to those who decree unrighteous decrees, who write misfortune which they have prescribed to rob the needy of justice, and to take what is right from the poor of my people, that widows may be their prey, and that they may rob the fatherless. The leaders were actually writing laws designed to oppress people. They were creating legal systems that gave them permission to steal from the poor. Meanwhile, these same corrupt leaders were deeply religious, at least on the surface. They showed up at the temple regularly. They offered the required sacrifices. They observed the festivals. From the outside, they looked like devoted followers of God, but their worship was completely empty because their lives were full of wickedness. Isaiah chapter 1, verses 13 through 15 records God's response: bring no more futile sacrifices. Incense is an abomination to me. The new moons, the Sabbaths, and the calling of assemblies, I cannot endure iniquity and the sacred meeting. Your new moons and your appointed feasts my soul hates. They are a trouble to me, I am weary of bearing them. When you spread out your hands, I will hide my eyes from you. Even though you make many prayers, I will not hear. Your hands are full of blood. God was rejecting their worship. Every sacrifice they brought, every prayer they offered, all of it was disgusting to him. Why? Because you can't worship God in the temple and then oppress people in the marketplace. You can't sing praises on the Sabbath and then cheat the poor on Monday. You can't claim to love God while crushing his children under your feet. The people thought their religious rituals would cover their sins. They thought as long as they maintained the ceremonies, God would overlook their injustice. But God saw right through it. Their hands were full of blood, the blood of the innocent people they had exploited and destroyed. Isaiah chapter 3, verses 14 and 15 show God's confrontation. The Lord will enter into judgment with the elders of his people and his princes, for you have eaten up the vineyard. The plunder of the poor is in your houses. What do you mean by crushing my people and grinding the faces of the poor? It says the Lord God of hosts. God was holding them accountable. They had devoured what belonged to the poor. They had stolen and hoarded. They had crushed people, grinding them down without mercy. This was the social reality that Isaiah had to address. A society where the rich got richer by stealing from the poor, where justice was for sale, where the vulnerable had no protection, where religion and wickedness lived side by side as if there was no contradiction. Years into Isaiah's ministry, a major crisis erupted that threatened the very survival of Judah. Two neighboring kings decided to join forces against Jerusalem, and their plan was nothing short of regime change. The two leaders were Rezin, who ruled over Aram from Damascus, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, who had seized the throne of Israel, the northern kingdom. These two nations shared a common problem. The Assyrian Empire was expanding westward, conquering territory and demanding tribute. Rezin and Pekah decided their best chance of survival was to form a coalition to resist Assyria together. But King Ahaz of Judah refused to join their alliance. Maybe Ahaz didn't trust them. Maybe he thought he could make a separate deal with Assyria. Whatever his reasons, Ahaz said no to the coalition. Rezin and Pekah were not happy about this. They decided that if Ahaz wouldn't join them willingly, they would force him out and replace him with someone who would cooperate. So they formed a military alliance and prepared to march against Jerusalem. Isaiah chapter 7, verses 1 and 2 describe what happened. Now it came to pass, in the days of Ahaz, the son of Jotham, the son of Uzziah, king of Judah, that Rezin, king of Syria, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, king of Israel, went up to Jerusalem to make war against it, but could not prevail against it. And it was told to the house of David, saying, Syria's forces are deployed in Ephraim. So his heart and the heart of his people were moved, as the trees of the forest are moved with the wind. The armies marched toward Jerusalem. They couldn't capture the city in their first attempt, but they were positioned nearby, and everyone knew they would try again. When the news reached King Ahaz, panic set in. The text says, their hearts were moved, as the trees of the forest are moved with the wind. Picture a forest during a violent storm, with every tree bending and swaying. That's how the king and the people were reacting. Total fear, complete panic. And honestly, they had reason to be afraid. Ahaz was facing a two-front attack from experienced military powers. Together, these two armies represented a serious threat, but the situation was even worse. Verse 6 reveals the full conspiracy. Let us go up against Judah and trouble it, and let us make a gap in its wall for ourselves, and set a king over them, the son of Tabel. They weren't just planning to defeat Judah in battle. They were planning to remove Ahaz from the throne and install their own puppet, king. This was a direct attack on the line of David. God had promised that David's descendants would sit on the throne of Judah. If Rezin and Pekah succeeded, They wouldn't just be changing political leadership, they would be interrupting God's redemptive plan. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Ahaz was young and inexperienced. His father had just died, and he had only recently taken the throne. Now he was facing the biggest crisis of his life, and he was terrified. Everyone was asking, "What are we going to do?" Ahaz looked at the situation from a purely human perspective. Two armies against one. Without help, Judah would likely fall. So he started considering his options. And there was one power strong enough to deal with Aram and Israel, Assyria. If Ahaz could get Assyria on his side, Aram and Israel wouldn't stand a chance. It seemed like the smart political move, the logical solution. But there was another option Ahaz wasn't seriously considering: trusting God. Judah was God's chosen nation. Jerusalem was the city where God had placed his name, and God had made promises to David's family about their throne lasting forever. Instead, Ahaz was making political calculations. His heart was shaking like trees in a storm because he was looking at the problem through human eyes only. He saw the armies, but didn't see the God who controls the armies. While King Ahaz was consumed with fear, God decided to intervene. He sent Isaiah directly to the king with specific instructions about where to meet him. Isaiah chapter 7, verse 3 records God's command. Then the Lord said to Isaiah, "Go out now to meet Ahaz, you and Shear-Jashub your son, at the end of the conduit of the upper pool, on the highway to the fuller's field." This was a very specific location. The conduit was part of Jerusalem's water system. The highway to the fuller's field was where people took their clothes to be washed. Why would Ahaz be there? Most likely, he was inspecting the city's water supply. When preparing for a siege, water is critical. If an enemy surrounds your city and cuts off outside water sources, you need enough water stored inside to survive. Ahaz was probably checking the infrastructure, planning for the worst. God told Isaiah to bring his son along. Shear-Jashub wasn't a common name. It was a prophetic name, meaning a remnant shall return. Every time someone said the boy's name, they were making a prophecy. Even in judgment, God would preserve a remnant. So Isaiah and his son walked to where Ahaz was working. And into this scene of anxious planning, the prophet arrived with a message from God. Verse 4 contains the core message, "And say to him, take heed and be quiet. Do not fear or be faint-hearted for these two stubs of smoking firebrands, for the fierce anger of Rezin and Syria, and the son of Remaliah." Look at the language. Take heed and be quiet. Stop panicking. Stop running around in fear. Pay attention and calm down. Do not fear or be faint-hearted. This was a direct command. Fear was natural, but God was telling Ahaz not to give in to it. Then came the brilliant metaphor. These two stubs of smoking firebrands, Rezin and Pekah, who seemed so threatening, were nothing but smoking stubs in God's eyes. A firebrand is a burning stick. But these weren't even proper firebrands anymore. They were stubs, almost burned out, just smoking remnants. They looked dangerous, but they had no real power left. Notice that God didn't even bother to say Pekah's name. He just called him the son of Remaliah, as if he wasn't important enough to name. These kings who seemed so powerful to Ahaz were barely worth mentioning in God's perspective. Verses 5 through 7 explain the conspiracy. Because Syria, Ephraim, and the son of Remaliah have plotted evil against you, saying, "Let us go up against Judah and trouble it, and let us make a gap in its wall for ourselves, and set a king over them." The son of Tabal, thus says the Lord God, "It shall not stand, nor shall it come to pass." God acknowledged the plan. Yes, they were conspiring. Yes, they wanted to break through the walls. Yes, they planned to overthrow Ahaz. But God's verdict was simple and absolute. It shall not stand, nor shall it come to pass. This wasn't a prediction based on military analysis. This was God declaring what would and wouldn't happen. The conspiracy would fail, not because Judah was strong, but because God had decided it wouldn't happen. The message was clear. Ahaz didn't need to fear. He didn't need to panic or make desperate deals. All he needed to do was trust God and stay calm. The threat that looked so overwhelming was nothing to God. Isaiah wasn't finished. After telling Ahaz not to fear, he explained why the conspiracy would fail and what would happen to the threatening kingdoms. Verse 8 begins, "For the head of Syria is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is Rezin." God was making a point about limited power. Rezin controlled Damascus, and Damascus controlled Aram. That was it. He didn't control Judah. He didn't control God's plans. Then God added a timestamp. Within 65 years, Ephraim will be broken so that it will not be a people. Ephraim was another name for Israel. God was saying that within 65 years, Israel would cease to exist as a nation. This assured Ahaz that the northern kingdom threatening him now would eventually be wiped out completely. Verse 9 continues, "The head of Ephraim is Samaria, and the head of Samaria is Remaliah's son." Again, God was emphasizing limited authority. Pekah controlled Samaria, and that was it. Then came one of the most important statements. "If you will not believe, surely you shall not be established." This was the key. God was offering protection, but it came with a condition: faith. Ahaz had to actually believe God's promise. If he didn't believe, if he relied on his own schemes instead, he wouldn't be established. His reign, his dynasty, his kingdom wouldn't last. This was a direct challenge. God was saying, "I'm offering you complete security. I'm promising you these enemies will fail, but you have to trust me. Your political survival is linked directly to your faith." The Hebrew wordplay is powerful. If you don't stand firm in me, you won't stand firm at all. If you're not secure in your faith, you won't be secure in your throne. For Ahaz, this meant he had a choice. He could trust God's promise, or he could trust his own political instincts and make an alliance with Assyria. He could stand firm in faith, or he could rely on human power. One path led to security, the other led to destruction. God was offering complete protection without any military alliance, without tribute payments, without complicated negotiations. All Ahaz had to do was believe. But as we'll see, Ahaz was already leaning toward trusting Assyria instead. After delivering the message about not fearing, Isaiah received another word from God for Ahaz. This time, God was going to make an extraordinary offer. Isaiah chapter 7, verses 10 and 11 record what happened. "Moreover, the Lord spoke again to Ahaz, saying, 'Ask a sign for yourself from the Lord your God. Ask it either in the depth or in the height above.'" This was stunning. God was inviting Ahaz to ask for any sign he wanted, any sign at all. As deep as the grave or as high as the heavens. Think about what this meant. Ahaz could have asked for anything. He could have said, "Make the sun stand still." He could have asked for an earthquake, fire from heaven, the immediate death of his enemies. Any miracle, any wonder, God was offering to provide it. Why would God make such an offer? Because he wanted Ahaz to trust him. God knew that Ahaz was wavering, considering making a deal with Assyria. So God was going above and beyond, offering to provide whatever proof Ahaz needed. It was an act of extraordinary grace, but Ahaz's response revealed what was really in his heart. Verse 12 records what he said, "But Ahaz said, 'I will not ask, nor will I test the Lord.'" On the surface, this sounds pious. Ahaz was quoting a principle from Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 16. He was making it sound like he was being appropriately humble. But this was completely fake humility. God himself had just invited Ahaz to ask for a sign. When God offers to prove himself, it's not testing him to accept that offer. Ahaz was using religious language to cover up his unbelief. He was using a Bible verse as an excuse to reject God's help. Why would Ahaz refuse? Because he had already made up his mind. He had already decided to send messengers to Assyria. He had already chosen to trust in political alliances rather than divine promises. Asking God for a sign would have obligated him to trust God, and that's not what he wanted. This is why Isaiah's response in verse 13 is so sharp. Then he said, "Hear now, O house of David." Is it a small thing for you to weary men, but will you weary my God also? Isaiah was frustrated and God was frustrated. Ahaz wasn't just rejecting the sign, he was rejecting God himself. Notice that Isaiah addressed him as House of David. This was a reminder of who Ahaz was supposed to be, a descendant of David, the king who trusted God even when facing Goliath. But Ahaz was nothing like him. The phrase, "weary my God," is striking. How do you weary God? By refusing his grace, by rejecting his help when he offers it, by using spiritual language to hide a heart that doesn't trust him. This moment revealed the true state of Ahaz's heart. He wasn't interested in what God wanted. He wasn't willing to walk by faith. He wanted to trust in what he could see and control. Ahaz had refused to ask for a sign, but God was going to give one anyway. Since the king wouldn't ask, God would provide his own sign, one that would be far more significant than anything Ahaz could have imagined. Verse 14 contains one of the most famous prophecies in the Bible. Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. This wasn't just any sign. This was the Lord himself providing confirmation. The sign involved a virgin conceiving and bearing a son. The Hebrew word alma refers to a young woman of marriageable age who is a virgin. This wasn't talking about a woman who was already married. This was talking about a virgin, someone who would conceive in a way that defied natural explanation. The child would be named Emmanuel, meaning God with us. This name was itself a message. God was not distant or unconcerned. He was with them. Even when they rejected him, God remained present, involved, committed to his purposes. This prophecy had layers. In the immediate context, there was probably a young woman who would soon have a son, and this child would serve as a time marker. But the language pointed to something far greater, a future virgin birth that would bring the ultimate Emmanuel. Verses 15 and 16 give the immediate application, curds and honey he shall eat, that he may know to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the child shall know to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land that you dread will be forsaken by both her kings. Before this child reached the age where he could make moral decisions, probably around age 2 or 3, the threat would be over. Both Rezin and Pekah would be gone. This was God's timeline. Within a few years, the crisis would be resolved. But Ahaz didn't believe it. He had already rejected God's offer. So even though God graciously provided this prophecy, Ahaz was going to ignore it and do things his own way. The name Emmanuel, God with us, should have been a comfort. No matter what they faced, God was with them. But to receive the benefit of God with us, you have to actually believe that God is with you, because Ahaz rejected God's protection and chose to trust Assyria instead. Isaiah had to deliver another prophecy, this one much darker. God was going to let Ahaz have what he wanted, and he would discover it wasn't what he thought. Verse 17 contains the ominous announcement. The Lord will bring the king of Assyria upon you and your people and your father's house, days that have not come since the day that Ephraim departed from Judah. Ahaz wanted Assyrian help. He would get the Assyrians, but they wouldn't come as helpers. They would come as conquerors. Verses 18 through 20 paint a vivid picture. And it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord will whistle for the fly that is in the farthest part of the rivers of Egypt, and for the bee that is in the land of Assyria. They will come, and all of them will rest in the desolate valleys, and in the clefts of the rocks, and on all thorns, and in all pastures. In the same day the Lord will shave with a hired razor, with those from beyond the river, with the king of Assyria, the head and the hair of the legs, and will also remove the beard. God would whistle for Assyria like calling a dog. The Assyrian army would swarm like bees, covering everything. And God would use Assyria like a razor to humiliate Judah. Shaving the head, legs, and beard was complete shame. Ahaz thought he was hiring Assyria to protect him, but God was allowing Assyria to humiliate Judah. The land would be devastated. Valuable vineyards would become overgrown with thorns. People would survive by keeping just a couple of animals. This was the consequence of trusting Assyria instead of God. God gave Isaiah yet another sign to demonstrate what was about to happen. This time it was a living sign in the form of Isaiah's own son. Isaiah chapter 8, verses 1 through 4 describe what happened. Moreover, the Lord said to me, "Take a large scroll and write on it with a man's pen concerning Maher-shalal-Hash-Baz, and I will take for myself faithful witnesses to record, Uriah the priest and Zechariah the son of Jeberechiah." Then I went to the prophetess, and she conceived and bore a son. Then the Lord said to me, "Call his name Maher-shalal-Hash-Baz. For before the child shall have knowledge to cry, 'My father and my mother,' the riches of Damascus and the spoil of Samaria will be taken away before the king of Assyria." God told Isaiah to write down a name on a public scroll with witnesses. The name was Maher-shalal-Hash-Baz, meaning speed the spoil, hasten the booty. Then Isaiah's wife became pregnant and gave birth to a son. With this prophetic name, the meaning was clear. Plunder is coming quickly. Before this baby could even speak his first words, the wealth of Damascus and Samaria would be carried off by Assyria. The two cities threatening Judah would be conquered. The threat would be eliminated exactly as God had promised. This child's name was a daily proclamation. Every time someone said Maher-shalal-Hash-Baz, they were prophesying the defeat of Rezin and Pekah. The boy was a walking reminder that God's word would come true. History confirms this prophecy was fulfilled. Within a couple of years, Assyria conquered Damascus and killed Rezin. Shortly after, Pekah was assassinated. Everything happened exactly as God said it would. The crisis resolved itself just as God promised, not because of Ahaz's political maneuvering, but because God had decreed it, despite all the judgment Isaiah had to proclaim. Despite all the warnings about destruction and exile, God didn't leave his people without hope. Woven throughout Isaiah's prophecies were glimpses of something beautiful, something that would come after the darkness. And one of the most powerful images Isaiah received was the promise of light breaking into darkness. Isaiah chapter 9, verse 2 contains this stunning prophecy. "The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in the land of the shadow of death, upon them a light has shined." This wasn't talking about a small candle or a dim lamp. This was a great light, powerful enough to pierce through the deepest darkness, bright enough to transform everything it touched. The people Isaiah was describing were walking in darkness, not just experiencing a temporary night, but living in ongoing darkness, stumbling through life without direction or hope. They were dwelling in the land of the shadow of death, a phrase that captures the feeling of being close to death, living under its constant threat, surrounded by despair and hopelessness. But into this bleak situation, light would shine, not gradually, not dimly, but powerfully and suddenly. The light would come to them. They wouldn't have to search for it or earn it. It would simply shine upon them, transforming their entire experience. Verse 3 continues, "You have multiplied the nation and increased its joy. They rejoice before you according to the joy of harvest, as men rejoice when they divide the spoil." The coming of this light would bring multiplication and joy. The nation that seemed to be shrinking and dying would suddenly grow. The people who had been mourning would find reasons to celebrate. The verse gives two comparisons to help us understand the kind of joy this would be. First, it would be like the joy of harvest. Think about farmers who have worked all season, planting seeds, tending crops, watching and waiting. Then comes harvest time, when all that work pays off. The barns are full. There's abundance. The hard work succeeded. That's pure, deep, satisfying joy. Second, it would be like the joy of warriors dividing plunder after a victory. When soldiers win a battle and get to share the spoils of war, there's excitement, relief, and celebration. They survived. They won. Now they get to enjoy the rewards. That's the kind of joy this light would bring. This prophecy was pointing to something specific. Isaiah was seeing into the future, to a time when someone would come who would be the light of the world. Someone who would shine into the deepest darkness of human sin and death. Someone who would bring joy like harvest and victory combined. The people didn't understand the full meaning when Isaiah first spoke these words. But he was painting a picture of the Messiah who would one day come. The light that was promised wouldn't just bring emotional comfort or spiritual enlightenment. It would bring actual, concrete deliverance from real oppression. Isaiah's prophecy continued with images of physical liberation. Verse 4 describes what would happen. For you have broken the yoke of his burden and the staff of his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor, as in the day of Midian. God was going to break the instruments of oppression. The yoke was what they put on animals to make them work, a symbol of being forced into labor, of having no freedom. The staff on the shoulder was the burden people had to carry, the weight pressing down on them. The rod of the oppressor was the weapon used to beat and control people. All of these would be broken, not loosened, not made lighter, but completely broken and destroyed. And the comparison Isaiah used was significant, as in the day of Midian. This referred back to a story in Israel's history found in the book of Judges, when Gideon and a small army defeated the vast Midianite forces. It was a battle where God showed his power in an unmistakable way. The victory didn't come through superior numbers or better weapons. It came through God's supernatural intervention. Isaiah was saying that the deliverance from oppression would be like that. It wouldn't be accomplished through normal human means. It would be a divine act, a miraculous breaking of chains, a supernatural liberation. Verse 5 adds another powerful image. For every boot of the tramping warrior in battle tumult, and garments rolled in blood, will be used for burning and fuel of fire. The boots soldiers wore as they marched into battle. The uniforms stained with blood from warfare, all of it would be burned up. This was a picture of war ending. When you don't need military boots anymore, when blood-stained battle gear is just fuel for fire, it means peace has come. The Messiah wouldn't just bring light, he would bring the end of oppression. He would break every yoke. He would destroy the weapons used against God's people. He would bring such complete peace that instruments of war would become obsolete, useful only for burning. This was the kind of deliverance Isaiah was promising. Then Isaiah made one of the most famous announcements in all of Scripture. He explained how this light would come, how this deliverance would happen. It would all center on a birth, a very special child who would be born into the world. Verse 6 begins, For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given. Notice the two different phrases. A child is born speaks of his humanity. He would enter the world the way every human does, through birth. He would be a real child, a real human being, born in a specific time and place. But a son is given speaks of something else. This wasn't just any child being born. This was a gift from God, a son given from heaven to earth. The verse continues, and the government will be upon his shoulder. This child wouldn't remain a helpless baby. He would grow to carry the weight of leadership. Government, the authority to rule, the responsibility to lead, the power to make decisions, would rest on his shoulders. He would be a king, but not just any king. He would carry governmental authority in a way that would surpass all earthly rulers. This was extraordinary. Isaiah was prophesying about a child who would be both human and divine, both born and given, both a baby and a ruler. The prophecy held tensions that wouldn't make complete sense until centuries later, when this child would actually come. But Isaiah was faithful to report what God showed him. Even if the full picture wasn't yet clear, Isaiah didn't stop with just announcing the child's birth. He went on to list the names this coming ruler would carry. And these names are unlike any ever given to a human king. The verse continues, and his name will be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. 4 names, or perhaps 5, depending on how you divide them, each revealing something essential about who this child would be. Wonderful Counselor or Wonderful Counselor speaks of his wisdom. He would give counsel that was wonderful, beyond normal human understanding, filled with insight that could only come from divine knowledge. When you need guidance, when you face decisions, when you don't know what to do, this king would provide wisdom that was truly wonderful. Mighty God is a shocking title. This wasn't just saying the king would be powerful or that he would represent God. This was calling the child himself Mighty God. He would possess divine power. He would be God in the flesh. For Isaiah to say this about a coming child was remarkable. No ordinary human king could ever be called Mighty God without it being blasphemy. But Isaiah was prophesying about someone who would truly be God while also being truly human. Everlasting Father speaks of his care and his eternity. A father protects, provides, nurtures, and loves his children. This king would be like a father to his people, but an everlasting one, never dying, never abandoning, never failing in his care. He would demonstrate the perfect fatherly love that lasts forever. Prince of Peace describes both his character and his reign. He wouldn't be a warrior king who ruled through violence. He would be a peace bringer, establishing harmony, ending conflicts, creating wholeness. Where he ruled, peace would reign. These 4 names together painted a picture of someone who was fully divine and would reign perfectly. No human king in Israel's history ever lived up to these titles. But Isaiah was seeing someone in the future who would fulfill every single one of them. Isaiah's prophecy about this coming child king continued with details about his kingdom. This wouldn't be just another dynasty that would eventually fail like all the others. This would be something eternal. Verse 7 declares, "Of the increase of his government and peace there will be no end." Most kingdoms eventually stop growing. They reach their peak and then decline. But this kingdom would be different. It would keep increasing. The government would keep expanding. The peace would keep spreading. There would be no end to it, not because it would plateau at maximum size, but because it would continually grow forever. The verse continues, "Upon the throne of David and over his kingdom, to order it and establish it with judgment and justice from that time forward, even forever." This connected the prophecy to God's promise to David. Centuries earlier, God had promised David that his throne would be established forever. At the time Isaiah was prophesying, that promise looked uncertain. The kingdom was declining. Foreign powers threatened. The royal line seemed weak, but God hadn't forgotten his promise. This child would sit on David's throne, not temporarily but forever. He would order and establish the kingdom with judgment and justice. These weren't just nice-sounding words. Judgment meant he would make right decisions, ruling with wisdom and fairness. Justice meant he would treat people correctly, giving everyone what they deserved, protecting the vulnerable, and punishing wrongdoing. And this wouldn't last for just a lifetime or even a few generations. It would continue from that time forward, even forever. This was a kingdom with no expiration date, a reign with no end, a dynasty that would never fall. The verse ends with a crucial statement: "The zeal of the Lord of hosts will perform this." How could Isaiah be so sure this would happen? How could he promise an eternal kingdom when every other kingdom in history had fallen? Because this wasn't depending on human strength or political skill. The zeal, the passionate commitment, the intense dedication of the Lord of hosts would accomplish it. God himself would make sure this prophecy came true. Later in his ministry, Isaiah received another vision about the coming Messiah, and this one used different imagery. Instead of talking about a child being born, it talked about a tree that seemed dead but would come back to life. Isaiah chapter 11. Verse 1 describes what Isaiah saw. "There shall come forth a rod from the stem of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots." Jesse was David's father. So talking about Jesse's stem was another way of talking about David's family line. But why describe it as a stem and roots instead of a thriving tree? Because by the time this prophecy would be fulfilled, David's royal line would look like it had been cut down. The kingdom would fall. The monarchy would end. Foreign powers would conquer Jerusalem. The descendants of David would lose their throne. From the outside, it would look like God's promise to David had failed, like the family tree had been chopped down and was dead. But Isaiah saw something others might miss. Even when a tree is cut down, the roots remain underground. And from those roots, from that stump that looks dead, a new shoot can grow. A branch can emerge and become a new tree. That's what would happen with David's family. When the kingdom seemed finished, when the royal line appeared extinct, a new shoot would emerge, the Messiah growing from the ancient roots of Jesse and David. Verse 2 describes what would rest on this branch. The Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and of the fear of the Lord. The Spirit of God would rest on him permanently, not coming and going like it did with the judges or the prophets, but resting, settling, remaining, abiding. And this Spirit would bring specific qualities: wisdom, the ability to make the right choices; understanding, the capacity to grasp what others miss; counsel, insight to guide and direct; might, strength to accomplish what needs to be done; knowledge, deep awareness and comprehension; fear of the Lord, proper reverence and respect for God. This branch from Jesse's root would be filled with God's Spirit in every way possible. He would have everything needed to rule perfectly. Isaiah continued describing how this Spirit-filled branch would rule. And it would be completely different from how earthly judges and kings operated. Verse 3 begins, "His delight is in the fear of the Lord, and he shall not judge by the sight of his eyes, nor decide by the hearing of his ears." Most judges decide cases based on what they see and hear. They watch witnesses, they listen to testimonies, they look at evidence. But this judge would operate differently. He wouldn't be limited to external observations. He wouldn't be fooled by appearances or swayed by smooth talk. Verse 4 explains how he would judge. "But with righteousness he shall judge the poor, and decide with equity for the meek of the earth." The poor and meek, the people who usually get ignored or taken advantage of in human courts, would receive righteous judgment from this king. He would treat them fairly, giving them equity, making sure they got justice even though they had no money or power. The verse continues with images of his power in judgment. "He shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall slay the wicked." His words would be powerful enough to strike the earth. His breath would be enough to defeat the wicked. He wouldn't need armies or weapons. Just his word would be sufficient to execute judgment. Verse 5 describes his character. "Righteousness shall be the belt of his loins, and faithfulness the belt of his waist." In ancient times, people wore long robes, and they would tuck them into their belts when they needed to work or fight. The belt held everything together. Isaiah was saying that righteousness and faithfulness were so much a part of this king that they were like the belt that held his entire character together. Everything about him would be marked by righteousness and faithfulness. Then Isaiah's vision expanded to show what the world would look like under this king's reign. The changes wouldn't be just political or spiritual, they would extend to all of creation. Verse 6 paints an extraordinary picture. "The wolf also shall dwell with the lamb, the leopard shall lie down with the young goat, the calf and the young lion and the fatling together, and a little child shall lead them." Animals that are natural enemies would live together in peace. Predators and prey would lie down side by side, and a small child would be safe leading them. No fear, no danger. Verse 7 continues, "The cow and the bear shall graze, their young ones shall lie down together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox." Even the diets of animals would change. The lion, a carnivore, would eat straw like a peaceful ox. The bear, usually dangerous, would graze peacefully alongside cows. Their young would lie down together without any threat. Verse 8 shows how complete this peace would be. "The nursing child shall play by the cobra's hole, And the weaned child shall put his hand in the viper's den. Even the most dangerous creatures, venomous snakes that can kill with one bite, would be safe around children. Babies could play near cobra holes. Toddlers could put their hands into viper dens. There would be no danger at all. Verse 9 explains why. They shall not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountain. For the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea. The reason for this universal peace is that the knowledge of the Lord would fill the earth completely. Just as water covers every part of the sea floor, with no dry spots anywhere, the knowledge of God would cover the entire earth. When everyone truly knows God, when His presence fills everything, there's no room for violence or destruction. This was Isaiah's vision of the kingdom the Messiah would bring. Not just a better political system, not just reformed laws, but a complete transformation of reality itself. The curse that came into the world through sin would be reversed. Creation would return to the harmony it had in the beginning. Peace would reign everywhere, and it would all happen because of this child who would be born. This branch who would grow from Jesse's root. This king who would rule with perfect righteousness forever. If this story moved you, if Isaiah's incredible journey from the temple vision to these messianic prophecies opened your eyes to something profound, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe to stay connected with more biblical stories that reveal God's plan throughout history. Share this video with someone who needs to hear about the hope Isaiah proclaimed, the hope of a coming king whose government and peace would never end. The story of redemption didn't end with Isaiah. It was only beginning, and you're part of that continuing story.